only a small portion of the increase in house prices earlier this decade can be attributed to the stance of U.S. monetary policy. Now you notice that has a footnote, because he's citing all these economists. Now, next. Now, if you look at the end note, he's citing, he says, see, for example, Jerrick's, Kinsley, and Smets. He doesn't tell you what the study is, but the problem with pulling this kind of sleight of hand in the age of the internet is that when somebody gives you a source, even if he doesn't mention the name of the article, you can generally find it on the internet. So you should do that. It's not smart for dishonest economists to do that. If someone's going to look it up, but of course, I guess nobody does, even though this is a paper delivered before a bunch of professional economists. So what did they write in their study? We find that monetary policy has significant effects on housing investment and house price, and that easy monetary policy designed to stave off perceived risks of inflation in 02 to 04 has contributed to the boom in the housing market in 04 and 05. This is hardly a situation in which they found no relationship, quite the contrary. So again, Bernanke's level of desperation, just like Greenspan's, is that he's going to quote sources that contradict it as though they support it. Now let me shift. I've got Krugman. Yeah, well, all right. We'll do Krugman again. When he did, how did economists get it so wrong? He also published a new edition of his book of his on the return of Depression-era economics, in which he kept using, he resurrected in this magazine his example of the babysitting co-op. And the babysitting co-op is, well, read it. I'm giving him a lot of space. We'll get to it in a moment. I'd like to explain the essence of Keynesian economics, which of course he thinks is, explains everything, with a true story that also serves as a parable, a small-scale version of the message that can afflict entire economies. Consider the travails of the capital of babysitting co-op. The co-op is an association of about 150 young couples who agree to help one another by babysitting for one another's children when parents wanted a night out. Next. I'm going to give him the space to, to hang himself. Okay, what do you think of this story? Okay, the story is the babysitting co-op had insufficient demand, and they had to print more money, more tickets. But it's less important to know that than to understand what he says in a moment about it. Don't dismiss it as a silly and trivial. Economists have used small-scale examples to shed light on big questions ever since Adam Smith saw the roots of economic progress in the pin factory, and they're right to do so. By the way, he's absolutely right about that. Simple examples are always best as long as they capture the important elements of the reality, and all for Robinson Crusoe economics. The question is whether this particular example, in which a recession is a problem of inadequate demand, there isn't enough demand for babysitting to provide jobs for everyone who wants one, gets at the essence of what happens in a recession. Now that's indeed what he believes. There was inadequate demand. He's explained the meltdown. Next. The economy of even a small nation, actually now I'm quoting from his other book that was brought out, The Return to Depression Economics, in which he's also covering the babysitting pool. This movie makes a direct statement about the problems with the model. The economy of even a small nation is, of course, far more complex than that of a babysitting co-op. Among other things, people in the larger world spend money not only for their current pleasure, but also to invest for the future. Nicely he realizes that in the big world, there is also a capital market in which those with spare cash can lend an interest to those who need it now. Okay, so he's agreeing that the babysitting pool co-op story is only about inadequate demand, which he thinks explains it. That's why he's resurrecting it. He's explaining what happened. This is the Keynesian explanation, and this explains what happened. Now, next chart, there it is. Now, this is something you can access on the website of the Bureau of Economic Analysis about GDP. Now, you notice I've only taken 3 years, 06 to 07, 08. Gross domestic product was growing in 06 and 07, and by 08, you see that top line, it went down to 0.4%. Well, as a matter of fact, I think that's been revised. Anyway, that was the beginning of the recession, essentially when gross domestic product stopped growing in 08. Now look at personal consumption expenditures. That's the babysitting pool. That's where it was all happening. And this, by the way, is the contribution to GDP by each of these components. we had 2.01% growth in personal consumption expenditure in 07, in 06, and 1.84 in 07. Now notice what was beginning to go negative, investment, and now notice the component of investment, residential, as everyone knew, that was beginning to go negative. And by the way, that's a small part of GDP, residential investment, but this is its contribution. It was they mainly minimized by how much residential investment was collapsing. Because it was a small part of GDP, it was still making a huge negative contribution because it was collapsing so quickly. So all I'm saying is that if you look at the numbers, then the first question that arises is, what do you have to explain? Well, you don't have to explain any failure of consumption. You have slight weakness in consumption, and we can get in a moment to explaining why that was the case. The failure was clearly the residential market. The failure was clearly the interest rate market. That was the production of new homes. That's the residential investment that we're talking about. So the point is that just look at the numbers and you'll realize your babysitting co-op is totally irrelevant. In fact, any time you look at what leads up to a recession, you'll always find it's a failure of capital investment, pretty much the way the Austrians tell you it is. So how can you possibly talk about a babysitting co-op? Now, of course, the reason, by the way, that personal consumption expenditures began to grow more slowly in 07 was because of the suffering, the collapse in the housing market, in the construction of housing, was causing unemployment. The unemployment rate began to climb in 07. That's the reason why a secondary effect of recession is weakness in consumption. But all of that is fairly elementary, except it eludes somebody who wears Keynesian blinders and who wants to believe in the Keynesian model. He'll say it's a failure of demand when clearly it was a failure of residential housing having to do with the crash in the housing bubble. Well, I've actually gone faster than I thought. I tell you what, I'm going to go on now to the government expansion enterprises. And that's, oops. Oh, yeah, there we go, yeah. Fannie and Freddie, the two, what has been called, they have been called the evil empire. And truthfully, the things that they did, the pressure they were under, the whole grisly story of them is the subject of a trash novel about, or a Dickensian novel about evil doings. Anybody who said anything against them was usually stamped out in different ways. There was a guy who published some sort of mild criticism of them. He was part of a bank. He was on the board of trustees of a bank, and they started a campaign against him. They truly were a tough bunch. Now, we're going to talk about them, the government-sponsored enterprises that were traded in the market. They sold debt, and as you probably know, the interest rates that were offered on their debt were just a little bit above the treasury rate, and the reason for that was that it was assumed by the market that if their debt could not be paid, that the government would pay off that debt. And of course, the market is absolutely right. The people who are taking it in the net are the people who bought the homes and who can't pay their mortgages. We'll sympathize with some of them, maybe not sympathize with others, but they're the ones who are going under. The people who bought Fannie and Freddie's debt are fine. The taxpayer is paying off that debt, to the tune of a few $100 billion. So that was Fannie and Freddie. But I want to shift now to another statement about them, and that's this is a quote from a best-selling book about the meltdown. It's the one that seems to be the most respected. I wrote a column about the 3 books about the meltdown that you shouldn't read, the 3 bestsellers about the meltdown. One of them is written by Simon Johnson and James Quack. Johnson is an MIT professor, I think at the Sloan School. Quack is a consultant out of Boston. And this book has commanded a lot of undeserved respect, I think. Here's a quote from it about where it treats the subject of Fannie and Freddie, and these are two brief quotes. The financial crisis was not primarily due to Fannie and Freddie, and there they give you an endnote, and you know how I